Long before child welfare laws existed, a quiet estate in rural Ohio was seen as a safe haven for children. Behind that image, though, the orphanage hid disturbing truths that are difficult to piece together even today. Children were sent there with promises of care and protection, but many disappeared or suffered under strict control that left lasting scars. Records from journals, letters, witness accounts, and local files tell parts of the story, but many questions remain unanswered. In the spring of 1856, the estate, about 5 miles from the nearest town, gained attention as a hopeful project. The property covered 30 acres of farmland with fields, woods, and a creek on its edge. The main house was 2 stories, with shuttered windows and a gabled roof, recently renovated to house more children. Several outbuildings were converted into sleeping quarters, a kitchen, and storage. The orphanage was run by a well-known family, listed in the 1850 census as owners of a successful business. Newspapers praised them as generous citizens who cared deeply for children in need. Letters show that parents from nearby towns were encouraged to place their children there, believing they would receive food, shelter, and guidance. On arrival, children were placed in dormitories by age and gender. Rooms were plain but clean for the time, each child getting a bed, a small chest, and access to shared dining and recreation areas. Staff included family members and 2 local attendants, who were instructed to enforce strict routines and obedience. At that time in Ohio, child welfare was mostly left to private families or charities. There was little state oversight, no standard inspections, and poor reporting, allowing many issues to go unnoticed. Despite this, the orphanage enjoyed a strong public reputation. Visitors saw orderly grounds, an orchard, and a vegetable garden tended by older children. The clothing was simple but practical, and meals were modest but acceptable for the period. Yet letters from parents hinted at unease about the isolation of the estate and its rigid routines. Some neighbors recalled unexplained delays when trying to visit or strange absences of children. The first intake of children included a 7-year-old girl, Mary Ellen Thompson. Her parents left her in May 1856, thankful and trusting. She was assigned a small upstairs room with a bed, washstand, and chest. The door was locked at night by the matron, Mrs. Abigail Reynolds. At 8:15 p.m., Mrs. Reynolds checked on Mary Ellen and noted she was safe and in bed. By morning, the child was gone. The bed was undisturbed, the room still locked from the inside, and the windows latched. Nothing was missing and there were no signs of a struggle. Witnesses, including an attendant, confirmed she had been seen asleep the night before. Staff searched the building and grounds but found nothing. Her parents wrote letters of disbelief, one published in the Ohio Gazette, demanding answers. Authorities investigated the locked doors, shuttered windows, and lack of escape routes. They searched nearby fields, woods, and homes, but no trace of Mary Ellen was found. Records show the case ended with the note, "Child missing, circumstances unknown, investigation ongoing." It was the first of several unexplained disappearances tied to the orphanage. By early summer, townspeople began to talk quietly. The community of about 70 households shared observations through stores, churches, and gatherings. They noticed odd delivery times, sometimes late at night, with no one checking the supplies. On June 2, 1856, records show a shipment of bedding and boxes arrived at 9:15 p.m., handled only by the family. Neighbors also noticed troubling behavior in the children. They seemed fearful, withdrawn, and reluctant to speak. Some flinched at raised voices or avoided windows when adults came near. These small details fed suspicions that the orphanage was causing hidden distress. Personal diaries and local newspapers later noted repeated disturbances at night, adding to the growing unease about the estate and the family running it. In June 1856, the Ohio Gazette published an article describing a farmer's report of hearing children's voices in distress coming from the orphanage at night. Constables interviewed neighbors, many of whom confirmed strange noises, often from the upper floors and in one case, from the basement. These sounds were irregular and difficult to explain as normal household activity. The notes preserved from that time make clear that these reports were written immediately, without exaggeration. Neighbors also noticed the family kept to themselves, limiting visits and rarely interacting with local officials or clergy. A letter to the township magistrate in July 1856 requested closer oversight of the orphanage, citing unusual activity and reports of children appearing unusually timid. Yet no inspection was recorded, reflecting the weak regulations of the era and the family's strong public reputation. The unresolved disappearance of Mary Ellen Thompson, combined with these reports, fueled growing unease. No confirmed proof of abuse was yet found, but late-night deliveries, unsettling sounds, and withdrawn children suggested that the outward image of safety did not match what was happening inside. On July 14, 1856, farmer Samuel Whitaker wrote in his journal that he awoke to faint cries coming from beneath the orphanage. He described hearing what sounded like children calling from the basement. No one was outside, and all attendants were accounted for. Too fearful to approach, he noted the incident carefully. This was the first direct claim of distress linked to the basement, adding urgency to later investigations. Between August and December 1856, county records confirm at least 4 more disappearances of children ages 6 to 10. On August 18, 10-year-old Samuel Randall vanished. On September 3, 8-year-old Clara Jenkins disappeared. On October 21, 9-year-old Thomas Whitaker was gone. And on December 2, 6-year-old Lillian Monroe vanished. Each case mirrored Mary Ellen's. The child was last seen asleep, doors and windows were locked, and no signs of struggle or escape were found. Logs kept by attendants claimed routine checks were made, doors latched, and children accounted for. Yet investigators later found small inconsistencies, conflicting times, slightly different descriptions of bed arrangements, and subtle gaps in record-keeping. Parents wrote letters to county officials expressing alarm, noting how children were safe at night but missing by morning. Officials, however, lacked authority to enforce strict inspections. Observers also noticed changes in the children who remained. They avoided eye contact, stayed quiet in shared spaces, and seemed fearful during ordinary play or chores. Medical references at the time linked such behavior to trauma, though reports did not directly connect it to the disappearances. By December 1856, concern was high enough for a direct inspection. County Officer Jonathan Pierce examined the buildings closely. He documented each room, noting measurements, locks, and latches. In Samuel Randall's former room, he found signs of tampering, scratches on woodwork, loose floorboards, and a latch that showed deliberate interference. His report suggested intentional concealment. This marked the first official sign that disappearances at the orphanage were not random accidents. Records from late 1856 and early 1857 also describe a strict, punishing environment. Children woke at 5:30 a.m., washed in cold water, completed chores, and ate meager meals of bread and porridge. Visitors noted that the children looked underfed and wore worn clothing despite promises of new garments. Punishments for small mistakes were severe. Children were isolated in bare rooms, denied food, or forced into extended labor. Diaries and letters describe intimidation as constant. Children told to stay silent at meals, avoid eye contact, and obey without question. By December, these practices left clear marks. Children were timid, withdrawn, and spoke only in whispers. One child, Henry Lom, quietly told a visiting relative, "There is a room. No one goes there. They tell us never to speak of it." This was the first mention of a secret room inside the orphanage, its purpose unknown. This discovery added a new layer to the investigation, hinting at hidden spaces and deepening suspicion about what truly happened within the estate. On January 17, 1857, county investigators launched a full inspection in response to the repeated disappearances and growing demands from parents and local citizens. During the January 1857 inspection, investigators uncovered a hidden area on the upper floor. Behind a false wall panel, they found a concealed chamber about 8 by 10 feet, with a low ceiling and a single, partly covered window. Inside was a cot with worn bedding and restraints fixed to the floor beams, showing marks of repeated use. Journals, scraps of clothing, and small personal belongings were left scattered, as if abandoned in haste. The journals contained entries written by multiple children. One chilling passage read, The dark corners are our days and nights. No one speaks. No one comes. We count hours by the echo of the door latch. Investigators saw these writings as direct evidence of fear and confinement, not exaggeration. The clothing in the room, including patched dresses and rough trousers, was stained and heavily worn, suggesting long periods without proper care. Simple bowls and utensils showed that meals were delivered inside rather than shared in the dining area, reinforcing the isolation. The atmosphere was described as oppressive. Damp wood, unwashed fabrics, and sparse furnishings created a setting meant to break down the children's sense of freedom. Marks on the floor and frame indicated the chamber had been opened occasionally but carefully maintained to avoid detection. No architectural plans mentioned this space, highlighting its deliberate concealment. While examining the far wall, inspectors also noticed a small, irregular doorway leading downward, likely toward the basement. Sawdust and uneven boards suggested recent work. The report ended with the note, "An additional passage has been discovered. Further examination required." This discovery added urgency, revealing that the orphanage contained hidden areas designed for control and secrecy. Despite this, the family maintained their spotless reputation. Through 1857, they continued hosting church events, giving donations, and opening their home for social gatherings. Newspapers praised their generosity, and visitors described well-kept grounds and children who appeared orderly and attentive. County records show the family made frequent charitable contributions and funded repairs and seasonal celebrations, further strengthening their public image. When inspectors or clergy visited, children were carefully presented, quiet, polite, and well-dressed. Any signs of fear were suppressed through instruction or chores. Letters from townspeople expressed disbelief when hearing about disappearances, as the family seemed beyond reproach. One letter from March 1857 read, "It is unfathomable to imagine that within these walls suffering persists, for all appearances suggest care and concern." On April 9, 1857, the orphanage accepted a new child, the sibling of one who had already disappeared. The guardians who delivered the child left reassured, unaware of the danger. This moment highlighted the ongoing contrast, the home's charitable image on the outside and the hidden suffering within. By the fall of 1862, some children who had vanished years earlier began to reappear. They were located through family efforts, county investigations, and occasional sightings. Their ages now ranged from 10 to 16, and their absences had lasted between 2 and 6 years. These children showed immediate and severe trauma. Reports described memory gaps, difficulty speaking, and fear of recalling daily life in the orphanage. One investigator noted that a 14-year-old girl, Sarah W., could only refer to her time there as the long rooms or the locked space. She spoke slowly, hesitantly, often pausing for long stretches. Behavioral signs included avoiding eye contact, trembling, and flinching at sounds like doors opening or raised voices. County physicians identified these symptoms as long-term stress, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Some children would not speak at all except when repeatedly prompted, while others gave fragmented statements like, "The rooms they watch, we don't speak," or "I cannot sleep where they keep the others." Investigators documented these accounts carefully, treating them as direct evidence of the conditions inside the orphanage and noting both verbal and nonverbal signs of psychological distress. Reintegrating the returned children into ordinary life proved extremely difficult. Teachers and clergy reported that they struggled to connect with other children, often keeping to themselves and refusing to join in group activities. Letters and diaries from relatives describe how long it took for them to adjust to simple routines like regular meals, caring for their clothes, and basic hygiene. Even everyday sounds, footsteps, closing doors, or unfamiliar voices caused intense fear, showing just how deeply the orphanage had affected them. Investigators noted that many children had trouble recalling timelines or identifying peers. One 12-year-old, for example, could not say how long they had been confined, speaking only of groups and corners rather than names or places. Such attempts at memory often triggered agitation, repetitive movements, and verbal repetition. A particularly striking case occurred on October 3, 1862. A child who had remained silent began repeating the phrase, "They are still there in the small rooms. They wait." Investigators treated this as evidence that more children might still be confined somewhere on the estate. Despite follow-up searches, no additional proof was found. The trauma was undeniable. Selective mutism, fragmented memory, and visible anxiety all pointed to the long-term effects of intimidation, neglect, and forced isolation. Reports emphasized the likelihood that some children were still missing and that hidden spaces on the property had yet to be uncovered. Authorities documented that while the orphanage appeared orderly on the outside, the children's behavior, withdrawal, trembling, flinching, told another story. The methods of control extended beyond physical punishment. Fear of what might happen kept the children subdued. Anticipation of punishment, forced silence, and manipulation of trust created lasting psychological scars. Children learned to suppress speech, avoid eye contact, and internalize fear, behaviors that continued even after leaving the orphanage. Later archival reviews uncovered another disturbing possibility: not all missing children had remained on the estate. Some were likely transported elsewhere under the guise of placement or apprenticeship. The records were incomplete or intentionally vague, leaving many questions unanswered. By early 1863, authorities recognized that accountability was still elusive and the scope of the case wider than first believed. On March 1863, local officials launched a formal investigation. Inspectors interviewed staff and neighbors, but the family insisted on being present during questioning, often offering explanations for inconsistencies. Staff testimonies frequently contradicted logbooks, and recollections varied from person to person. Neighbors described normal routines but also noted odd late-night activity, withdrawn children, and unusual handling of supplies. Property searches were carried out systematically. Investigators surveyed each room, noting blocked access points and altered flooring. The hidden chamber was carefully documented, with objects catalogued and photographed. Attention then turned to the basements and storage areas. Resistance from the family slowed progress, as they repeatedly delayed access by citing illness, travel, or charitable duties. On March 28, 1863, a major discovery was made: a leather-bound journal hidden beneath floorboards in the secret chamber. Inside were detailed records of children admitted to the orphanage, with cryptic notes on their behavior, health, and eventual disappearance or transfer. This suggested deliberate record-keeping and concealment. Investigators noted its importance but stopped short of drawing conclusions, pending further analysis. On April 15, 1863, another dramatic event occurred. A 14-year-old named Samuel T. attempted to escape the orphanage. Reports reconstruct his effort in detail. He had studied the estate for weeks, learning where staff moved and where supervision was weak. Shortly after dusk, he slipped into a hidden passage behind the eastern storage wing. The passage led into a utility corridor toward the rear of the property. The corridor itself was filled with obstacles, uneven boards and makeshift barriers clearly placed to block movement. Using a small hidden lantern, Samuel made his way quietly, avoiding patrols. Along the way, he passed rooms containing wooden crates, some marked with the initials of missing children, along with garments and journals. Investigators later confirmed that these spaces had been used for temporary confinement and storage of personal belongings. Samuel showed signs of extreme stress but also remarkable awareness. He paused to avoid detection, copied staff routines, and stayed silent despite hearing noises around him. He eventually reached the rear perimeter and found a locked gate leading to the public road. Using a bent iron rod taken from a maintenance closet, he tried to force the latch open. Samuel's attempt to escape the orphanage nearly succeeded. He managed to partially open the rear gate, but a caretaker spotted him and a chase followed across the grounds. He was captured less than 50 yards from freedom. In his testimony, Samuel described seeing more hidden passageways, rooms, and storage areas during his escape, giving investigators new leads about concealed spaces inside the estate. Though his capture was a setback, the event provided crucial insight into how the orphanage was structured and how children lived under constant confinement and fear. Reports emphasized that while Samuel was returned to the estate, his observations confirmed survivor accounts and revealed new areas requiring inspection. Investigators noted his severe psychological trauma, reinforcing the urgency of continued inquiry. By May 1863, word of the orphanage's abuses began spreading beyond the immediate township. Newspaper articles, letters, and town records show how awareness grew, sparking outrage and demands for accountability. On May 10, the Ohio Gazette published a full report outlining missing children, survivor testimonies, and evidence of hidden confinement rooms. Other county papers picked up the story, amplifying it further. Editorials condemned the orphanage, calling its operations a violation of moral and religious duty. Parents reacted swiftly. Some withdrew their children from local orphanages and charities, while petitions for oversight and inspections flooded town meetings. Minutes from these meetings record urgent pleas for legal action. If such cruelty exists so near, whom may we trust with our young? The law must act, and swiftly. Local authorities faced intense pressure. Inspectors worked methodically, but rural Ohio's limited laws and resources slowed progress. Officials began surveying other orphanages in nearby counties, fearful that similar abuses might be hidden elsewhere. Communities also formed informal watch groups, monitoring deliveries and activities around the estate, while neighbors provided shelter and support for returning children. Even with growing awareness, communication remained slow. Reports traveled by telegraph, stagecoach mail, and local papers, creating uneven knowledge across towns. While the scandal was widely known, many details remained unclear. On May 28, 1863, the situation escalated dramatically. The family running the orphanage abandoned the estate without warning. Neighbors reported their sudden disappearance, noting that livestock, wagons, and household property were also gone. Attempts by law enforcement to track them failed, as records were incomplete and the family knew local travel routes well. County files recorded the stark reality. The absence of the responsible parties leaves justice deferred and accountability incomplete. Investigations must proceed in absentia, and the fate of undiscovered children remains uncertain. By June 1863, investigators faced a major obstacle: missing or destroyed records. Orphanage ledgers, police logs, and administrative documents were incomplete, with many pages missing, stained, or altered. The gaps were most noticeable during periods when disappearances had occurred. Some surviving journals recovered from hidden rooms were burned or shredded, leaving only fragments. Investigators cataloged these remains, noting cryptic references to unnamed children, confinement dates, and coded notes. Police records were also inconsistently kept, with many interviews never formally written down. Letters between inspectors and the magistrate reveal frustration at the lack of reliable evidence. Parents of missing children express despair in their own letters. One dated June 12, 1863 reads, "Without the papers that record where my child was sent or seen, I am left with nothing but conjecture and dread." The absence of complete records made it nearly impossible to reconstruct events or confirm the number of victims. Still, one small discovery hinted at a wider truth. Hidden beneath the eastern wing of the estate, investigators found a fragment of a journal containing dates, initials, and possible location codes. Though unclear, it suggested that some children had been transferred or moved far from the orphanage, expanding the scope of the tragedy. The remaining documents were brief and incomplete, leaving major questions unanswered and adding to the mystery surrounding the orphanage's operations. Records confirm that many files were destroyed or deliberately altered, making it impossible to determine the full fate of all children. This concealment compounded the horror of the abuse, ensuring that both authorities of the time and historians today face lasting uncertainty. Survivors who left the orphanage carried severe trauma throughout their lives. Reports and letters describe long-term symptoms we would now recognize as PTSD, selective mutism, and chronic anxiety. Many children struggled to adapt to normal routines, showing fear of enclosed spaces, startled responses to everyday sounds, and obsessive repetition of phrases. Some, like Emily R., refused to enter rooms without windows. A physician in 1865 documented her trembling, disrupted sleep, and inability to socialize. Teachers and guardians noted that survivors avoided groups, distrusted adults, and asked constant questions about threats. Even in caring homes, their trauma remained visible. Diaries reveal hypervigilance, fear of authority figures, and sensitivity to footsteps, slamming doors, or distant voices, sounds that reminded them of confinement. As they grew older, the effects shaped their education, jobs, marriages, and even parenting. Records from the 1860s also note panic attacks, mutism, and dissociation, with trauma passing into the next generation. Children of survivors sometimes developed anxiety and mistrust of institutions themselves. One survivor, interviewed in 1868, admitted, "Sometimes at night, I hear whispers, faint, like the children in the hidden rooms. I know it is memory, but it feels as though they are still there." This showed how deeply the orphanage remained present in their lives. By the late 19th century, the Ohio Orphanage was abandoned and erased from everyday memory, but its story lived on in fragmented archives. Reports, newspapers, and testimonies highlighted not just the suffering but also the failure of oversight. Officials of the 1860s admitted that existing laws were inadequate to protect children, and the case helped push for reforms, regular inspections, better record-keeping, and accountability for private institutions. Survivors' voices confirmed the abuse was real, not rumor. Clinical evaluations documented mutism, anxiety, and hypervigilance decades later. Letters and diaries recalled forced labor, isolation, and betrayal of trust. Newspaper retrospectives between 1872 and 1880 portrayed the orphanage as a cautionary tale of cruelty hidden behind a facade of respectability. Yet the number of children lost was never determined, as too many records were missing or destroyed. Historians emphasize that the incomplete evidence keeps the case unresolved, its unanswered questions contributing to its dark legacy. The orphanage became both a turning point in child welfare and a lasting reminder of how easily abuse can hide behind public respectability. The final notes in the archive reflect this duality. The building is gone, the family vanished, but the children remain, in memory, in history, and in the echoes of trauma carried for generations. Survivors bore lifelong scars, and some children were never found. The Ohio Orphanage stands as proof of systemic failure, cruelty concealed by appearances, and the fragments history chooses to preserve. The story of the Ohio Orphanage does not end with the closure of its doors or the disappearance of the family who once ran it. In many ways, that was only the beginning of its lasting legacy. The fragmented records, incomplete testimonies, and scattered journal entries left behind continue to haunt both historians and descendants alike. What was uncovered through inspections, survivor accounts, and community memory paints a picture of systematic abuse hidden behind the mask of charity. Yet for every detail recovered, countless others were lost: burned ledgers, missing correspondence, and vanished children who never returned. This deliberate concealment compounded the cruelty, leaving not only victims but entire communities with questions that could never be fully answered. For the children who survived, the scars did not fade with time. Long after they were removed from the estate, they carried with them the weight of trauma, night terrors, fear of confined spaces, and the inability to trust adults or form lasting bonds. Their behaviors, hesitation in crowds, flinching at footsteps, whispers of voices they thought they still heard, were not simply quirks of memory, but living evidence of the torment endured. Some of these children attempted to rebuild lives, to work, marry, and raise families. But even then, the trauma often surfaced in the next generation, carried forward in patterns of mistrust, anxiety, and protective behaviors. The orphanage left its mark not only on individuals but on entire bloodlines. The wider community, once complicit through silence, could not ignore the truth forever. When survivor accounts and hidden chambers were exposed, outrage spread quickly. Town meetings filled with fearful parents, newspapers demanded accountability, and petitions pressed lawmakers to act. The case helped shape early reforms in child welfare, highlighting the need for inspections, clear record-keeping, and oversight of private institutions. Though the changes were gradual and uneven, the Ohio Orphanage became a reference point in the broader conversation about protecting children from hidden abuses of power. And yet, even as society moved forward, the orphanage itself slipped into shadow. By the late 19th century, the property was abandoned, and the family responsible had disappeared from public record. What remained were fragments, letters, journals, physician notes, and the memories of survivors. These fragments preserve enough to remind us of what happened, but never enough to provide full closure. The missing names, the unknown number of children lost, and the deliberate destruction of evidence ensure that the case remains unresolved. This absence of certainty is itself part of the horror, for it demonstrates how cruelty can endure not just in action but in erasure. Today, the Ohio Orphanage stands as both history and warning. It reminds us how institutions cloaked in respectability can mask hidden suffering. It shows us how power, when left unchecked, can exploit trust and silence the vulnerable. And it forces us to acknowledge that even when physical structures vanish, the echoes of trauma remain. Survivors lived with those echoes for the rest of their lives, and their testimonies, however fragmented, carry the weight of truth that time cannot erase. In the end, the orphanage is more than a story of one place in Ohio. It is a reminder of how fragile protection can be when oversight fails, how silence allows abuse to thrive, and how memory, however incomplete, remains our strongest defense against forgetting. The walls may have crumbled, the family may have vanished, but the voices of the children endure. Their whispers remind us that vigilance is not only a lesson of the past but a demand for the present.